Andy, I just got through reading your new book, One Pilot's Story, and I'll tell you, it's remarkable. I got chills just reading some of the things of your outfit, Memphis Belle, and I just wonder if you can tell me some of the memories that you have.
Every one of those crewmen was a volunteer, and they were the bravest men in the world, and most of them died. We lost 207 B-17s from my group. While I was flying in 1944, we lost 32 out of the 36 ships. The heavy bomber group has 36 heavy bombers. The first group that came over lost 38 out of the 36. But I don't think the people in America were ever aware of how heavy the losses were.
I have to ask you, how can you lose 38 out of 36?
Because as soon as a plane is lost, they bring in a new one. They lost, during a time period of about 6 weeks, they lost 38 planes. But they weren't all of the older planes. A number of them that were lost were the new planes that came in. A few of the older planes survived through all of the war, but not many of them did. When I came back from being shot down in Europe, there wasn't a crew face on the base except my own crew that I knew. Because the day that I was shot down, I was flying as a co-pilot and instructor pilot with the new crew. I was talking on the phone a few minutes ago with the man who flew whose crew it was that I flew with that day. And he's been back to France a number of times and has many memories of what happened there.
Speaking of France, how long were you flying before you got shot down?
About 5 months, really. I flew 15 missions. I was shot down on my 15th mission. I flew the 14th was to Kiel, I remember, because we lost a number of planes that day. And we lost an engine. The number 2 engine was shut out. You can't keep up with your group when you lose an engine. It goes a little faster than you can go. So we flew out over the North Sea and braced for a hit by the German fighters. But a P-51, and it shows a picture of that P-51 in my book, came out of nowhere. I don't know where he was from or who he was, but he flew on our wing until we were out over the North Sea, away from where German fighters could reach us, and we flew home and got home.
Did you have an escort at that time, or would they just leave you, basically?
The plane that came down to pick us up was a P-51, and we had just begun to have P-51s as escorts, and they could fly that far. The previous planes couldn't. P-38 didn't have the range to fly into the interior of Germany. But the P-51 did if it had on wing tanks and a fuselage tank. And I've always wondered who that man was and been very grateful to him.
I remember a few years ago you went back to France, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And you went to the same city and met some of the people there that actually helped you escape the Germans. Is that correct?
That's correct. The day that my 15th mission, I was flying with the new crew, and we were shot down, but when we bailed out, we came out in quite a trail of parachutes. And I saw as I was coming down toward a small meadow just about the size of a large living room. And there was a woman in the middle of the field. I don't remember what she was doing there, but as I came down, I landed right in front of her. And I was very lucky. We didn't get training in parachute jumps in those days, but I landed just right. And I remember as I rolled, as I came over and came up and unbuckled my parachute, the lady came running up to me. And she said, "Alleman? Alleman?" Well, I didn't know what Alleman meant. So I just looked puzzled, and then she said, "Au Français?" I knew what that meant, and I said, "No, American." And she hugged me on both, and kissed me on both cheeks, and grabbed me and said, "Run, run," all over. She said it in French.
But you knew what she meant.
That's what she meant, and I could see what she meant. I could hear the German patrol running in the distance to come and find us, to find those of us who'd bailed out. One of our crew was killed in the plane, and the rest of us bailed out. And eventually, she and her husband gathered 4 of us and took us to a nearby cave. It's described in that book that you mentioned. When I went back there to visit her years later, to visit them and thank them for saving my life, they held a village gathering in the village inn. And the lady who was in the village, who was in her late 60s by that time, came up and hugged me, and I hugged her back. We were very happy to see each other.
I bet.
because for about the 10 days that we hid in that cave, there was simply no food. The Germans took all the food, but they used their food, what they had to eat, and brought it to us to eat, so we didn't starve. We were kind of hungry by the time we got home, but we didn't starve.
As a Vietnam vet and as a combat documentary photographer, I remember several missions that I got to fly, rescue missions. And I know those stand out in my mind, very prominent. It's like almost yesterday. Can you share with me some of the missions that you had? And I know from your book, again, there were several missions that you talk about in your book. Maybe you can share those with me now.
We did cover a lot of country. I remember we bombed the airfields. We never bombed civilians. The 8th Air Force never did that. We bombed airfields and munitions plants. I bombed a bus truck factory at Munich 3 times, and each time it was deadly. We lost a number of B-17s, but we never bombed cities to bomb cities. We only bombed parts of cities that had munitions plants in them. The theory that they never told us, but eventually we learned, was that we would knock out the munitions plants, and in the process, the Germans would send up their fighter planes. And since we in our B-17s and B-24s had heavy armament, we had 10 50 caliber machine guns in our B-17s, we would knock off the German fighter planes so that when the Allies eventually invaded Europe, there would not be enough German fighter force to effectively destroy them. And that's what happened in the long run. But it cost a lot of us. I said before that every Air Force, 8th Air Force flyer was a volunteer, just as you were when you flew. And where did you fly?
At the time that I was there in 1971, 1972, the majority of the missions were flown in Laos. But as you know, that was a secret war at the time. It was something that wasn't spoken about often. We flew some precautionary missions near North Vietnam. I remember one in particular that we flew 11 and a half hour precautionary orbit. This was in May of 1972, and we were bombing about a mile away from the Hanoi Hilton. Nixon had just announced that peace was at hand, but for some reason, for the first time, we had gone into North Vietnam where we hadn't gone before. And that was really probably the only time that I remember flying into North Vietnam as opposed to Laos and picking up survivors with the HH-53 Jolly Green Giants, who I was initially assigned to.
You were about to take off in a plane one day, and one of your friends, who was a superior, came and took you off that plane.
That was my commander, Bill Hine.
And what happened to the plane you were going on?
Well, I was supposed to go on, it was just a training mission that we knew. And I was on the helicopter that morning, and Captain Hines pulled up in his Jeep, and he pulled me off the helicopter. Well, I wasn't even told why I was pulled off, but later on I found out it was because of a rescue mission that was happening, and whether it was prudent to send photographers on this rescue mission. Captain Hines decided it was not. It wasn't worth the risk. And because he pulled me off, I'm here to talk to you today. Fate, it's a wonderful thing, I guess. It determines that you and I are sitting across talking to each other. But let me ask you a couple things about, I know Tom Brokaw gave your generation a name, the greatest generation. What would you say was the difference between your generation and my generation that fought in Vietnam?
I don't know that there were big differences. War is a horrible thing. It was as horrible in Vietnam as it was in Europe. War is the killing of people. It's hard to kill people. I lived with 2 Russian soldiers who were captured at Stalingrad and brought as slave workers to work the factories in Germany. When I was in France in the war, I lived with them a while. The German army took all of the German men to be in the German army, and they had no men left to work the factories. So they used the prisoners they captured in Russia. And two of the prisoners who were working in a factory in Metz during a British bombing raid one night. The British bombed at night, we bombed in the daytime. So the British bombed to destroy areas while we bombed to destroy munitions. When they bombed the town near the town of Metz one night, they were destroying an area that built munitions for the German army. And the two Russians, Paul and Timofey, during the bombing escaped, came back across Alsace-Lorraine and into the French border and contacted some of the underground people and were hidden for a long time. And for a brief time, the three other men and I who escaped from our airplane lived with them in a cave. Eventually, the two Russians were repatriated and taken back to Russia.
Talking about the war, if I can go back for a moment, you had a defined purpose in the war, in World War II, as opposed to Vietnam, where there was no definition to that war. I think today still there's no real definition as to why we fought it. You know, it's open to a lot of interpretation. When I was fighting over in Vietnam, it was more, I found the war more, we were fighting to protect one another as opposed to any ideology. When you were fighting during World War II, was the ideology tantamount, or was it kind of similar to the Vietnam War, where it was the camaraderie? You were just fighting to save the next guy.
Well, we had a great deal of camaraderie, but we were trained, and it was a good thing. We were trained to think that the Nazi regime was a vicious regime, and it was. When I was hiding in the village in France, the French people said they had to be very, very careful, because if the Germans had any suspicion that the French were helping the Allies in any way, the Germans would just come and shoot them. And they did, often. We were very glad to get away from there. My memories of those missions, those 15 missions, sometimes wake me at night, because all of my friends, with one or two exceptions, were killed during that war. When I came back from Europe, only my own crew was left alive. The 2 days, 3 days later, on a mission to Meersburg, my group, the 91st, that's the Memphis Belle group, lost 13 of its 36 planes in that one raid. If I'd been back and flying with a crew of my own, I most certainly would not have lived through that raid. But the Nazi regime was a very, very bad one. I still can see no way that war could have been avoided. The Vietnamese War probably could have been avoided.
How did you handle the trauma and the night terrors, that some of which you suggest in your book, adjusting to all the horrendous things that you went through during the war?
I never had a great deal of difficulty adjusting to it. My book mentions one of our really good pilots who flew and never showed any nerves or nervousness, but one day on the base he just collapsed and he was sent home. The strain was too much for him. But I never had the kind of frightening aftermath of the war that many people did. I was very fortunate.
Yeah, it's a little bit different than, I think, a lot of my generation, those of us who fought in Vietnam. It's almost like we closed that chapter out. There was no closure, but we put it behind us. We were never able to think about it once we got out. There was a lot of disdain, the fact that we were there. I remember one trip in particular, I came into Los Angeles and I ended up at the Greyhound bus terminal downtown, and a young lady came up to me and I thought she was gonna say hi to me, and she spit at me. And those are the memories that I have, and I know are shared quite a bit. In fact, most people who fought in Vietnam, there's a saying, welcome home. And we have to acknowledge it amongst each other, because we don't feel, or most of us don't feel, that this country ever acknowledged us coming home and thanked us for it. Not that you fought to be thanked necessarily, but it was just a different thing. And then you hear all the heroes and you hear all the accolades from your generation that fought in World War II, and even the Korean War, I guess. They're kind of low-key. Nobody really talks about those people who fought in the Korean War too much either.
And that's a shame, because war is war, and it's the same anywhere. I was so lucky. But you had a difficult time, and it wasn't deserved. War is as bad in Asia as it was in Europe.
That's actually why I went in. I was part of the hippie culture, if you will, but civil rights were a big thing in my generation, and we marched for civil rights, both for Afro-Americans, for women, for minorities in general. And I just didn't know why we were fighting the Vietnam War and why we were treating the servicemen or talking about the servicemen the way that we were, that they were killers, baby killers, and it didn't make sense to me. And that was one of the reasons that I volunteered to go over to Vietnam, was just to see what it was all about. And I remember talking about missions, one, if I can share with you, and this was in April of 1972. It was a Spectre gunship that had gotten shot down. And are you familiar with the Spectre gunships? They fly real slow and they have the big cannons.
Yes.
And they had just installed the 105 millimeter cannon on it. And the purpose of them was to beat up the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the supply lines going into North Vietnam. And they got shut down quite a bit. And unfortunately, most of the time when we went in for rescues, not very many survivors were left. I remember that was one where I received an accommodation for taking over one of the miniguns. As a photographer, I would hang out of the aircraft and watch as the parajumpers go down on the ground or getting shot at. And it was the most fortunate thing in the world for me to have the honor to fly with these Jolly Green Giant crew members. They did nothing but risk their lives in order to save downed pilots. But on this one particular mission, we were getting shot at. So we were standing there or hovering for a lot longer than we anticipated. And I remember taking over one of the miniguns because everybody's on the ground picking these guys up. And my accommodation stated that I helped save the mission. But it was something that, when I think back on now, had I thought about what I was doing, would I have done it again? I don't know. So it's a curious thing to be in a situation where you're not thinking about yourself. You're thinking about those people around you.
That's why Tom Brokaw said the greatest generation, but it was your generation as well as my generation. The wars that our country has been in has brought out both the best and the worst in the men, and nowadays the women, that fought those wars.
I agree.
One of my memories that I do dream about was after a few soldiers in a Jeep came deep into France and picked us up, and we started back. The Germans were retreating from the American invasion, but they had mined all of the bridges. Europe is full of small bridges over small streams, and every one of those bridges had been mined, but they were mined with rather primitive mines. We stopped on each bridge as we drove through France and went beneath the bridge, and I can see those sticks of dynamite that were wrapped with wire, and we cut the wire and threw the dynamite into the bushes and went on.
Wow.
But we knew nothing about that kind of work, and I am amazed now at how much of it we did and how successful we were, and that we lived through it.
And if you'd had time to think about it, it's something you might not have ever done.
We might not have done it. The first bridge we saw, there was a German soldier on either end of the bridge with a gun. And we didn't have time to talk, but we debated a little bit. Well, there was an underground group that had contacted us and were right behind us. And as we watched, one of those underground groups went up and cut the throat of each of the sentries on each end of the bridge. Then we went down and took out the mines that had been put there, unwrapped the sticks of dynamite and threw them away, and then climbed back in our Jeep and drove on. As Tom Brokaw said, it was a great generation, but not because we were individually greater than any of the men in the wars today. Any man who fights, or woman, who fights in a war and puts his life up is a great person. As I watch some of those movies from those days now, the Memphis Belle movie is typical. I I'm just amazed at how accurate those flak guns were.
Receive action to try to avoid some of this flak. Be ready on rudder.
Flak gun is simply a 90 millimeter cannon pointed up. And when the shell bursts, the fragments of the shell blow through the airplane that are near them.
Up fuel, feather prop, fire extinguishers, generator off. Memphis Bell to group. We're gonna have to dive to put out this fire. Wingman, your lead plane now. Everybody, hang on.
The Germans were marvelous technicians.
You know, in Vietnam or in Southeast Asia, the jungle, the canopy was so dense that you couldn't see anything through the canopy. It sounds, we would fly low a lot of times with the helicopters, and you'd know that there was enemy fire watching the helicopter, because all of a sudden holes would start appearing in the helicopter. And that's the only way you knew that you were getting shot at, because you couldn't hear anything.
I remember we flew a mission one time to bomb supply dumps just after the invasion. We flew, in order to make our bombing as accurate as possible, we flew at 12,000 feet that day. We lost so many ships that we never flew that low again. The rest of our flights were anywhere between 20 and 30,000 feet. And it's cold up there. You have to wear an oxygen mask when you get above 12,000 feet. And at 12,000, we put on our oxygen mask and wear it the next 5 or 6 hours on our mission. After 10 or 15 minutes, the moisture in your breath freezes on the oxygen mask, and it won't work, so you have to take it off and break the ice out and put it back on. And the moisture in the air then would turn into a snowflake, and the roof of the cockpit was covered with snowflakes.
So the snowflakes went up.
The snowflakes went up.
Were there any times that you were melancholy? I mean, I know that we don't think about the missions that we're on. We go out and we're assigned a task, a duty, and we perform that as best as we can. It was at one point that I can remember so vividly, just saying to myself, you're not going to make it to your 21st birthday.
You're clear right. Quarters the way down.
Position from the ridge line. Roger, take Alpha to 75 position from the ridge line.
Charlie's over there. Sandy 3. You got some more Willie feeds right off your nose.
Okay, good looking. Outside the 3 o'clock.
Hold your hover. Hold your hover. Hold your hover. Hold your hover, babe. Hold your hover. Looking good. Hold your hover. Hold your hover. Survivor's coming up. It's about 10 foot off the ground. Hold your hover. Hold your hover. Hold your hover. Hold your hover, babe. Hold your hover. 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 Survivor's at the door. Survivor's coming in the door. Survivor, finish secure. Let's get the hell out of here. Okay, talk to me. We're coming out. Go on, coming out. Sandy, coming out. Okay, straight ahead. Straight ahead. Down that valley and get low. Get low. Get left and follow that valley, Charlie. See him heading straight out of this valley here and down the saddle. We're following you.
It's very, very difficult to watch your friends, watch them die, and then watch what's left of them come out of the airplanes when they come back to the base. The mission that we were shot down on, we flew 27 ship formations ordinarily, and we were the 27th ship that day. I remember how bumpy the air was. B-17s are powerful airplanes with 4 huge Pratt & Whitney engines. Every B-17 has 10 heavy 50 caliber machine guns, and there are anywhere from 15 to 25 planes in a formation. That's a lot of machine guns shooting at a fighter plane that's coming in at you. I remember seeing planes in front of me being blown up. When a plane is hit with a strong shot, it just explodes, a big blast of orange. One of the things I do remember most clearly is the tail end Charlie plane in the group ahead of us getting a hit in the cockpit and blowing up. I can't tell you why, but young men in the inspiration, I can only call it, of battle, don't think about dying. They think about how they're going to survive. But I remember saying in the midst of a heavy burst of flak one time, God, let me live 5 more minutes. Once our bombs have dropped, you can do what you want.
That's it. That's it. Bombs away.
Something very similar and parallel happened to me. We were flying a mission, and we fly with sister or 2 helicopters at a time. And I recall that one of our sister helicopters got hit by a heat-seeking missile. So we're speaking to them at one moment, and the next moment they're gone.
I have a son-in-law who works in a veterans hospital. He tells me of the veterans who are coming back with missing legs and missing arms. They have to be replaced. The fact that there was not enough armor to protect them when this new war was begun. But it's simply unconscionable that our troops were ever sent into combat without the proper equipment, both for their own safety and offensively.
Well, our war machine didn't start until after we had already gotten into World War II. So you guys went in somewhat similar circumstances. You didn't have
We didn't have any
that prepared.
body armor when we started, that's true. Because flak suits were developed by the 91st, by my group. We were the first to use flak suits. Then they were so,
Heavy.
well, they were so obviously useful that the crew used to bring so many flak suits on board that the pilot would often have to say to them, it's too heavy, throw some off. And I'm alive because I was wearing a flak suit that day that piece of flak came in. The skin of a B-17 or any airplane is very thin. It's not hard to penetrate. And a piece of flak comes through it in a hurry and hits hard. I was very fortunate that I had a flak suit on that day.
I see that Senator McCain wrote a foreword for you, and I can understand why. It's a tremendous book.
Yes, he did, bless his heart. I'm very fortunate to have known him. We were talking a few moments ago about the effects of war. When my wife and I went back to England a few years ago, it was the first time I'd been there since the war, and when I left England, it's hard for us now to realize how brave those British people were and are. London was burning when I left. Street after street had the buildings blown up and destroyed. The book says I went to a hotel one time to go in and I'd stayed there before, and I opened the door. The only thing left of that hotel was the wall the door was in. No one today can even imagine how badly London was blown up, blown apart. It was a war which I had hoped would never be repeated, and I think never will be.
I've read several books on World War II, and I've seen several films on World War II, but I must say that yours is probably the most personal experience. It kind of made me feel that I was sitting there and how it affected me on a personal basis, whereas before it was something that wasn't personal. It was just something that had happened before. And I really appreciate your efforts in writing this book and researching it and sharing it with me.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed the book, but I'm glad you weren't sitting there with me when it happened.
I am too. I agree with that. Well, Andy, thank you.
It's a pleasure to be talking with you.
Oh, it's all mine.